All right, welcome. So this morning we have two very welcome guests to speak to us on the topic of stress and trauma in cross-cultural workers. We have Dr. John Bergeron and Crystal Wilkins. Dr. Bergeron is the Director of Counselor Development at the Austin Stone Counseling Center in Austin, Texas. After he completed his undergraduate studies in Indiana, he completed doctoral and postdoctoral studies in Texas. He was in private practice for 10 years. Then he spent some time speaking and training and developing content, especially in the areas of foster care and adoption, and then joined the Austin Stone Counseling Center in 2015. His focus is anxiety, depression, marriage, parenting, adoption, and foster care, men's issues, addictions, trauma, and attachment. And he works with clients 16 and up. Dr. Bergeron is married with two adopted children. Both of his children are deaf, and the first child he adopted has special needs, and the second he adopted a child from China. Crystal counsels with the Austin Stone Counseling Center as well. She has extensive background working with children, teens, and parents, and since 2003 has been a certified child life specialist. Her master's is in counseling with a specialty in play therapy. She works with children and teens with a variety of needs, including illness, grief, trauma, attachment needs, anxiety, parental divorce, depression, and self-injury. And a special thank you to Crystal, who spearheaded the creation of this. This came about, we were in a meeting together, Crystal and Suzanne and I were, and we were talking about various topics, and the topic of trauma and stress came up, and I asked if she'd be willing to put together a presentation for those of us who do debriefings that really are aware of trauma but don't necessarily know what to do with it and really are not equipped for trauma. And so I asked if she and Dr. Bergeron would put together a presentation to equip us for awareness and sort of first degree triage so we can continue with our debriefings as we prepare someone for further care in trauma and stress. And so they put together this presentation for that. And so with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Bergeron and Crystal, and I'll be manning the slides here. So if you'll just tell me when to switch it over, I'll turn off my video and my audio, and unless I pop in to ask a question. Thank you,
Right.
guys.
Well, thanks, David. We really appreciate it. And I didn't know, I think in that next slide we had talked about, you did a great job introducing us. I just want to maybe add a few extra words just and maybe give Crystal a chance just to kind of give you an idea of what we do and kind of the folks we work with that might be helpful. As David mentioned, I do a fair amount of work with adoptive families and foster families, and so I'm kind of working most often with parents with a lot of trauma in their kiddos and some their own trauma. And so this is kind of a topic we end up navigating. And so I have done a fair amount of training around it as well. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity this morning to just share some of the knowledge and experience that God's kind of given us to you guys to help you as y'all help cross-cultural workers around the world as they're dealing with a lot of this stuff. So I don't know if you had any kind of additional things you wanted to add there, Crystal.
Yeah, no, similarly, David did a great job of introducing us. As he said, I work with kids as young as 3, all the way up to adulthood. And a lot of my experience with trauma has been both previously as my role as a child life specialist. I worked in children's hospital settings, worked with kids in the ER, and so would work very hands-on when trauma was happening right then. But then here at the Stone have been working mostly with children and families who've experienced trauma, more children who've been adopted out of trauma and have experienced more long-term effects from abuse or neglect or something along those lines. But inevitably, I think both John and I, we can see people experience a multitude of different things. And sometimes it's difficult to assess what is stress, what is a stressful situation, what's trauma, and And so one of the goals for today is to help you guys do that and to know how to engage and enter into conversations where you're trying to figure that out and trying to figure out how to care for people faithfully. So thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the first thing we had thought about starting with is just kind of a passage from scripture that I think is certainly one where we have a character who's under a lot of stress. And I think it highlights the real kind of power that any individual has in these kind of moments. And so let me just read that real quick for us, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. This is from Genesis 16. It says, "The angel of the Lord found her," this is talking about Hagar, "by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. And if we go to the next slide there's a little bit more of this passage. He says, he shall be, talking about the child, a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. And so she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. Or another translation, it says, you are a God who sees. For she said, truly, I've seen him who looks after me. Therefore, the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. And Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael. And so the key part of that passage just that we wanted to share was this idea that one of the very, first names of God given by a human being was given by a woman on the run, a slave girl, and how she characterizes her experience of God was a God who sees, because he saw her in her situation of stress and probably some trauma. And so we wanted to start with that story from scripture just to be a reminder that one of the most powerful things, even as a professional, I would say that we can do is be present with folks when they're struggling and feeling overwhelmed and see them where they're at. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today really are just different ways of sitting with, being with, and seeing a person as you're interacting with them who's experiencing distress and trauma, and knowing how to respond compassionately to that. So just wanted to start there. And then I think we're going to kind of move into the next section and just, I wanted to introduce it generally. We're going to talk about just some definitions of some words. So as we talk about trauma and stress, one of the challenging things is that our culture has kind of watered those definitions down quite a bit. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the differentiation of these things and a few aspects of trauma. And so I'm going to let Crystal jump in there and do a little bit of that for us.
So, so on the next slide, we see the two definitions of psychological stress being the mental and emotional strain caused by challenging or demanding situations, which all of us experience stress every day, right? Like traffic can be stressful. Kids experiencing a test can be stressful. You guys navigating a multitude of things that you have to do can be stressful. And stress in and of itself is not necessarily bad. In fact, it can actually help us be productive and get things done. And for kids, it makes them study. If I'm stressed at work, it makes me be more efficient and focused in the work that I'm doing so that I can get it accomplished, right? And so stress in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. And yet it can build up and make us struggle. But then we can also experience trauma. And so trauma is defined as an event or a multitude of events that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. And so what makes something traumatic isn't necessarily even the event itself, but it's oftentimes the meaning that we attach to it, or other variables can affect how it's experienced. As I said, I worked in children's hospitals, and I would sometimes get kids who came in from a motor vehicle crash, and I would have multiple siblings in different trauma rooms. And inevitably, there were some kids who were what we would call coping well with what was going on. They were compliant, they were answering questions, all of that. And then we'd have kids who were what we would call spinning out, and they were freaking out, maybe needed to be sedated to be able to manage what was going on. Reality was either one of those could have experienced that as traumatic, even the child who was being quiet. But really, we had to do a little bit further assessment of what was going on in their head and their mind and that sort of thing after the fact to determine how they experienced it. And so, but the key event is they're having a hard time coping with it. And that can be really shown outwardly, or sometimes we can see more inward symptoms of that, which we'll talk more about as we progress. The next slide shows a graphic of what an acute stress reaction is, and kind of the timeline associated with that. If we think of a big event that has happened, whether that is, again, a motor vehicle crash or observing something, maybe observing an assault or experiencing an assault or something along those lines, there tends to be this diminished capacity in different kind of time pockets. And so in that first few days following an event, individuals may have active or passive symptoms that impair their ability to be efficient and to do day-to-day things as efficiently or as presently as they typically would. But then for somebody who's experienced a traumatic response to that event, the month after and even months after, they stay kind of stuck in that pattern of inability to do the things that they would normally do, maybe re-experiencing the event, having triggers and symptoms associated with that event. And so it gives some kind of different key markers here of it would be typical for somebody who's experienced a traumatic event to experience several days of stress and maybe even a month or so of stress. But if they stay in that stuck pattern for a long period of time, that's not good. We need to be able to get additional care to them for them to be able to manage the level of that stress and how it's impacted them. So, John, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna maybe in terms of clarification of terminology that in the clinical world, often when we talk about trauma, we're typically talking about that window after the acute event and the acute reaction. And this is where the official terminology that you find in the DSM-5, which is our kind of manual for giving diagnosis, is post-traumatic stress disorder. There's not a diagnosis of trauma. If there's a diagnosis, it's PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we wanted to share this with you just to help you understand kind of where clinically that would come in. There aren't, super fine distinctions and lines, and it can look a little different in every individual. But just for kind of clarity's sake, wanted to share a little bit of that with you and give you guys kind of the terminology. Like, hey, are we looking at more an acute reaction, which may or may not turn into a more chronic stress or trauma kind of response? So,
Okay. I think you've got the next slide, John.
yeah, I think so. So I'm going to talk about just some of the potential traumatic experiences that can be triggers for trauma. And again, it's not really the event itself that causes trauma. We often talk about trauma as an event or determined by an event, but the traumatic experience might or might not cause trauma, because trauma, again, is the overwhelming of that individual's ability to cope. And so you, as Crystal was saying, you'll often have individuals going through the very same event, one experiencing significant trauma symptoms and the other one, just kind of normal levels of stress or distress. So But the kinds of things we're looking at, and you guys could probably give a much longer list of things that you guys have heard as you talked about cross-cultural workers or talked with them. Many of you, I understand, have been, and so trauma and just stressful situations part of life for sure. But the more severe ones we generally kind of see are likely to cause traumatic reactions are abuse and neglect of whatever variety in terms of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological abuse can all be um, triggers for and causes of trauma. Certainly experiencing natural disasters. So when floods come in, big storms, um, and they can cause them in a lot of different ways. I mean, sometimes it's witnessing some of the awful things that can happen. Sometimes it's just the unknown that's part of that, not being able to know what happened to a family member can itself be a trauma, and just some of that chaos, especially for kids, can be tough. Violence around an individual, and this is probably where a lot, maybe if I had to guess, most of the trauma we see in cross-cultural workers is, the community violence. It's part of unstable societies or violent societies. Certainly the cross-cultural workers I've worked with, that seems to be probably some of the primary. Certainly when there is domestic violence, that's another place where you see trauma kind of triggered. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but anything that brings about the sudden or violent loss of a loved one, the abruptness there is much more likely than losing, a loved one from a progressive illness like cancer, where you have time and you've got resources to begin coping with that before the loss. When it's sudden, you're much more likely to get a post-traumatic reaction from that. And if violence is also involved, that in addition to the loss, you're also dealing with a loss of a sense of safety because of that, and that adds to that traumatic effect. Traumatic separation, what we're talking about there can come about for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes kind of natural disasters or sometimes violent uprisings where kids and parents or spouses are separated. Sometimes it can be medical illnesses that, and that's Crystal's world she lived in, when kids especially aren't able to see a parent for long stretches of time due to kind of hospitalization or things like that. And in the cross-cultural worker world, though, that can be pretty frequent as healthcare is different, and sometimes family members have to leave for long stretches of time and be apart from their family members. So, and then serious accidents and life-threatening illnesses. Again, when those occur, all of the things attached to that, the accident itself, the treatment, in the hospital, and same thing with life-threatening illness. Often the kind of alien nature of what healthcare looks like can be very threatening and uh, cause the feeling of loss of control. That's a big part of trauma. So those are just some of the kind of events and experiences that can lead to trauma that we wanted to just kind of give you a quick background about. So the other thing I wanted to talk about in the next slide actually is a something you guys have probably heard of, and that's this idea of vicarious trauma. And this concept really first got fleshed out in some of the literature around first responders and particularly medical professionals that work with individuals who had experienced trauma themselves. And it was about kind of reflecting that when you are exposed to the stories and hear from and see the effects of trauma, it can cause trauma in you, particularly of the more chronic nature. And so this happens, when you're either witnessing the effects of that or hearing about it from the individuals themselves. And as I mentioned, first responders are pretty frequent, and really anybody in the helping profession. So counselors are another set of individuals, and you guys as people who talk with cross-cultural workers that end up experiencing trauma have a potential of kind of experiencing some level of certainly distress as you're hearing it, and potentially trauma going forward. And we're going to talk later about, hey, what does it look like to take good care of ourselves in that context and steward ourselves well so that we either kind of prevent that or help ourselves be more resilient to, experiencing those impact or effects of trauma for sure. So that's very vicarious trauma. The next thing we're going to dive into that we thought would be helpful is really just looking at what is the impact of trauma on the person. Because I think from a perspective a non-clinical perspective, it can be easy to see trauma as primarily or only just kind of an emotional reaction to bad things happening. And it actually, the more we've studied this, especially over the last couple of decades, the more we're understanding that it's a lot more than that. So I've got just a couple of slides that I want to just kind of present kind of the evidence that, man, it's more than just an emotional reaction. And so in the next slide is just a diagram of a brain. And if you collect kind of all the research on trauma, it points out that these are the primary areas that seem particularly susceptible to highly distressing or traumatic events. And these four different colored areas basically represent two primary sections of the brain, one called the frontal lobe, which is all about planning, organizing, attention and focus, problem solving. So that's the blue and the yellow area there. And then the other area is the amygdala and the hippocampus make up what we call the limbic system, which is really the system that monitors and manages kind of fight or flight for the most part, and our fear and anger reactions. What's interesting also is the hippocampus is actually the primary memory structure. And so that's right next to that amygdala, which is primarily about, the fear and anger reaction. And so these things are very closely tied together, and they have a lot to do with how traumatic memories are formed. And so I just share that diagram just to help us understand, hey, trauma is something that actually does happen to the brain. And in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you it actually makes changes in the brains. And so I've got three kind of pictures of different kinds of scans for you. And this first one is a scan that measures the electrical activity in the brain. And this is a person on the left that has been diagnosed with active ongoing PTSD. And the person on the right is a person who has not experienced trauma, just a normal control. And what you see is when they're put into the scanning machine, they're told to, hey, just relax. We're going to take some pictures of your brain, fall asleep if you'd like. And so they're supposed to be in a very relaxed state, which your brain in a relaxed state is supposed to look like the one on the right. But somebody with PTSD, their brain can't calm down. And so in the moment, their brains are firing off. And that's what the red and the orange and the yellow are showing, is that you have an overactive brain that's constantly going off, which translates into, a lot of easily distractedness, a high tension level, even when it's not necessary. And it's part of what creates a lot of the symptoms, both psychological and physical, with folks with trauma. So the next scan I wanted to look at is if we look at this, the brain from a chemical perspective. And this one in particular is looking at, hey, let's look at serotonin activity in the brain. And in this case, these are actually flipped from the other one. I thought I had fixed these, but in this case, the brain on the right is your traumatized brain, and the brain on the left is the normal brain. And again, what we're looking for here is actually higher levels of serotonin is healthier, because serotonin, as I listed at the top of that slide, have to do with having, a regulated mood, good appetite, being able to sleep, having a good sleep pattern, and then also being able to learn new information and retain that information. And so it's a really important chemical in our brain. This is a primary chemical that our antidepressants, the SSRIs, uniquely kind of target. And what you see with that brain on the right is a much lower level of serotonin. And so, not surprisingly, with trauma, you see all problems in all the areas listed above: mood, appetite, sleep problems, difficulty remembering things, and learning new information. So that's just kind of a picture of kind of chemicals. So far we've looked at, so electrically the brain gets changed and is off, chemically it's off. And then the last slide I have here, this scan is a CAT scan, which is just an X-ray of the brain. It's a static picture of the brain. And what you've got on the right is an individual with chronic, longstanding PTSD, and again, a person without a history of trauma. And you'll notice just big picture that the brain on the right is actually quite a bit smaller. The one of the effects of trauma is brain atrophy. Um, and so you see a shrinkage in the brain in the scan on the right. And the bottom part of that scan is a zoomed in focus on the hippocampus specifically, and you can see it outlined there. And you'll see that there's a difference of about, I think if I remember the study right, like 40% difference in the area taken up by the hippocampus, which is primarily um, a, a key piece of our learning and memory functioning in our brain. And so this is, again, this is structural. So this isn't, just an immediate brain impact like electricity and chemically, which can change pretty rapidly over time. This is what the brain looks like on the inside. And so the point I'm trying to make with all these slides is just that, man, this isn't just an emotional reaction. There are brain changes that occur, particularly the longer trauma and a post-traumatic illness goes on. And so getting folks help as early as possible after a trauma and getting it, them healthy as quick as possible is healthy for not just their psychological functioning, but even their brain functioning and their overall health as well. So
Hey,
that was just a quick overview. I didn't want to go too far into that, but I think it's helpful just to keep that in mind, is that there's something pretty significant and serious about what trauma does to us beyond just the difficult and painful feelings.
and Dr. Bergeron,
Yes.
that's fascinating. The question came up on the group. Does PTSD ever just in essence go away on its own, especially a child that had PTSD as a child? Is it something that they're going to carry with them all the way into adulthood, especially untreated? Because so many times, as parents, you just don't know, and
Yeah.
this happens, and is that going to be something that they're always going to carry with them?
Well, the symptoms, so diagnosis is given according to symptoms. And so the symptoms do tend to go away with time, even without treatment, because particularly in kids are resilient and they figure out a way to function typically. And so in most cases, even without treatment, the symptoms will go away. But what we know from research is that once a person has experienced trauma, particularly in childhood, they're way more likely to develop PTSD later in life if there's a subsequent intense stress or trauma. This is what we found with our soldiers, in war, is those soldiers that had childhood trauma were like 4 to 5 times more likely to develop PTSD than soldiers who had been through the same experiences that didn't have childhood trauma. And so we know that it has this chronic impact on kids and then into adulthood, even if they aren't showing the symptoms. So that's one of the reasons, again, even it's helpful to lean on the safe side, is even if a kid's not showing extreme symptoms, that at least a professional maybe has a chance to check them out if that's at all possible and do an assessment. So,
Very good.
Crystal,
Thanks,
you have
John.
anything?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, to add kind of on the attachment perspective with that as well, is research has shown that children can make significant recovery when they have one person who sees them, who values them, who cares for them, that it can offer them some of those reparative experiences that they maybe didn't get early on if they were, say, in foster care, experiencing long-term neglect or abuse, when they are adopted into a safe environment, and then offered those, you're going to get food every morning, and when you cry somebody responds to you, and when you're scared somebody nurtures that. Those attachment figures are really key in helping children be resilient, and that doesn't even have to be family. Like, it can be a coach, a youth minister, somebody along those lines. But it's important trauma is typically experienced relationally, and so it heals relationally. And so that's one of the key indicators for how do people heal and repair. So,
Good. Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you both. Appreciate that.
Sure. All right. Well, that leads us nicely into the next slide, where we're looking at trauma developmentally, and this just shows, I think, a really helpful graphic for us to remember that trauma can be experienced all the way back to utero into adulthood, and so specifically for babies who are in the womb, who have, say, a parent who's an addict, or where there's domestic violence going on in the home, they still experience the stress of the mom, and therefore they are experiencing the trauma themselves. And so we used to have a theory that if you don't remember what happened, if you don't have language to be able to describe it, then it won't affect you in the same way. But we've done a lot more studies since then and know that it does affect children as young as, again, experiencing it in utero. They just may not be able to process it as fluidly or as linguistically as others would. And so, yeah, and this next slide, just to give you a little bit of a preamble to this, is just a video that gives you kind of an indicator of somebody who experiences things and isn't having a traumatic response to something, and then somebody who does. And so, David, are you able to cue up that video? And hopefully,
I hope so. Let's see here.
You'll be on our side.
Oh, no, it says video isn't available anymore. Poop.
Oh, stink. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
sorry.
that's okay.
Okay.
I'm gonna figure out how to get back.
No, I'll give you a summary of what it is. If you Google it, like if you just Google soundtrack of trauma, something along those lines, or John can give
Shark music, I think, is what it.
There you go. That's
What'd you say?
Shark music is what it's called. Yeah, Circle Security, I think. Shark music video maybe pop up.
something along those lines. But it's helpful. Inevitably, at the beginning of the video, it shows this beautiful space, right? This beautiful beach and this trail that you're walking along, and it's this lovely, relaxing music kind of in the background, and it's lovely, right? And then it shows the exact same thing, but with the Jaws music, with Jaws, and inevitably, as you watch it, you'll have your own visceral response to it, which is helpful to understand what trauma can feel like, essentially. And I think it's helpful to understand for individuals who are experiencing trauma, it's kind of like the soundtrack that's always running in their mind and in their body and in the way that they experience the world. And they don't know how to turn that off. They don't know how to see the beautiful scene that's around them and not constantly anticipate danger or risk. And so, if you have a chance to look that up, shark music, Circle of Security. I've ruined it a little bit, so you may not have the exact visceral response, but helpful to watch.
And Crystal, when you find the right link, you'll send it to me. I'll send it back out to everybody.
That's a great idea.
Perfect. No, thanks, David. All right. And the next slide, again, talks about what are the impacts that we can see when individuals have experienced trauma. John did a great job of walking through what it looks like structurally, but what are we going to see live and in living color when we're interacting with individuals who've experienced trauma? And so we're going to see potentially physical effects. So for young children who've experienced trauma or are experiencing trauma, a lot of times they fail to gain weight. We have this medical term called failure to thrive. And so even when they're being fed, their bodies are so stressed out that they can't retain the calories in the same way a child who's not experiencing trauma does. Inevitably, if you see somebody, an adult, who's experiencing trauma, sometimes they fluctuate in how they eat and what they eat, and they may struggle again to maintain weight, or sometimes they gain weight, depending on what their stress and kind of what's going on in their body. And so physically, it can affect a lot. And as John said, their brain can change depending on how long they're in the trauma experience without help and support. It can lead to cognitive changes. And so it can lead to changes in certainly memory. I think the graphic is really helpful to understand why and how that can happen when the memory part of our brain is so closely connected to the limbic part of our brain that manages fight, flight, freeze, and attention, and just the way people process information can be quite different. When I'm processing through trauma, sometimes with kids, I'll give the analogy of because they'll get frustrated with themselves if they can't remember things just a certain way, or if they can't do something the way that they want to. Is experiencing trauma is kind of like having a puzzle piece. Like, you have the story in your brain and in your body, but it's been thrown on the floor. And so, like, you can remember one piece kind of at a time, but it's harder to see the whole cohesive narrative all in one swoop. And so that I've found to be a helpful metaphor when people specifically are processing through trauma and what they've experienced, and they get frustrated with themselves because they can't remember. To be able to offer that can sometimes be helpful. Emotionally, people can either be completely shut down and shut off, so maybe having more of a flat affect, or emotionally just kind of chaotic, for lack of a better word. And so their emotions can run high and low at any given moment. Socially and relationally, they can really struggle to be able to lean into people, or they can sometimes be manipulative with people, not necessarily consciously, but they're trying to stay safe. Like, survival is more important than relationship in that moment. And so sometimes they can engage in really interesting ways socially, or just have a high degree of lack of trust with relationships, even relationships who have offered care consistently over a long period of time, which can be frustrating for people who are trying to have a relationship with them and trying to offer care. It can be highly confusing. Motivation. This is based on a study actually that John found of just looking at kind of the general population. We all tend to have baseline motivations for what we do and why we do it. And if you look at the general population, it kind of gets spliced into three parts of primary motivators. One being achievement. And so what we do and how we do it, and am I able to accomplish the things that I've set out to accomplish? Am I competent in the things that I care about and I'm working on? About 40% of the population can fall into that category. Relationship can be kind of one of the other primary motivators of, am I able to, am I loved? Am I able to contribute meaningfully in relationship? And that can be kind of a primary motivator. And then there's control. And for individuals who've experienced trauma, they oftentimes have a higher degree of leaning into control versus these other two kind of primary motivators. And so achievement is about 40% of the population, relationship is about another 40%, but then control is another 20%. But you see it much in higher rates for individuals who've experienced trauma. So anything you would add to that, John? I know that's a study you found. So
Yeah, I was thinking the one other thing, that even in the midst of kind of distress or kind of early trauma, that it pushes all individuals. The more anxious we are, the more controlling we tend to be. And so sometimes that's actually can be a marker for, how a person is coping. If they're in a super high control mode that's unusual for them, and you see this with kids in particular, that can often be a symptom that they're not feeling safe and secure in their world, and so they're trying to control their world to get to a place of safety. And it makes it tough to parent a kiddo or interact with a kid or an adult that's in hyper control mode, for sure.
thanks. And then behaviorally, we can see behaviors that are kind of all over the map. Again, for kids who are experiencing trauma or have, or as well as adults, but inattention, difficulty focusing, hyperactivity and impulsivity is higher oftentimes for individuals who've experienced trauma. Communication can be tricky, either I have a friend that has trauma, and she utilizes communication as a, I'm going to tell you what you need to know, but only that much. And then I have to keep going back to her for more information and more information, more information. It's highly inefficient. I'm a very efficient gal. It's annoying. And so, but she holds on to that, I think, as a matter of control within relationship to help her feel safe. And it requires me relationally to keep going back and back, which then gives her that experience of, oh, she still cares. Oh, she still cares. Oh, she still cares. And so it makes sense, and yet can be really tricky and can lead to frustration when people don't understand where that's coming from. Hygiene can kind of go out the window, and so people don't necessarily take care of themselves in the same way. And so looking unkept or unwashed, so to speak, a lot of times, specifically, I'll see this with kids who've experienced sexual abuse, is they try to make themselves gross so that they can keep the predator at bay. They keep them away from them. And so, but in general, that can also be a sign of depression and depressive symptoms when somebody has experienced a trauma. Lying, again, they're focused more on survival, and so lying or manipulation can sometimes occur much more. Stealing, risk-taking behaviors, so they may not be thinking through the potential consequences of their behaviors as much, or sometimes they may be kind of doing what we would call a self-sabotage, where they're looking for rescue, and so they engage in these risk-taking behaviors to draw people in to help them. Again, that's not usually conscious. It's subconscious, but you can see a pattern develop. Aggression, this can be physically or verbally. They can be really aggressive in just kind of their way of being. And sometimes they can experience this lack of remorse or this lack of ability to see another perspective, to have empathy, any of those kinds of things. And again, when we think about the brain, the prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that helps with moral reasoning. It's the one that helps us with empathy as well. And so if that part of the brain is either underdeveloped or is kind of offline because they're stuck in that limbic part of their brain, it's going to be harder to demonstrate that. And so it's not necessarily a conscious, willful trying not to be remorseful, but it can be tricky. I kind of joke, this is maybe dark humor, but with a lot of my foster adopt families, they'll oftentimes come in and see me and they'll be like, I think my kid's a sociopath. And I'll be like, oh, okay, well, tell me why you think that. And a lot of it has to do with this lack of remorse, that kids will engage in sometimes wild behaviors, and yet they don't care about how that impacts the rest of the family, and that can be really disconcerting. And so I try to help them hang in there if not necessarily a sociopath. So let's hang in there and see. So okay, let's shift gears and think through how do we look at all of this information and make sense of it. And so John will lead us off in that.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of move into the space in which we're talking about. So you're sitting down with a family, an individual that's coming kind of back or still on the field, but you have the opportunity to check in with them. And so we wanted to, this was a challenging part of the process, just to kind of be full disclosure here, because we don't operate in this space, and I'm guessing you guys have probably a pretty varied set of ways in which you interact and roles. And so we're going to try to cover that as best we can, and then we're going to have some Q&A. So if you have specific questions that would fit what you're doing, definitely let David know that, and we'll tackle those at the end for sure. But just some general things that we came up with in terms of this process. The first thing we thought is, one thing is to always keep in mind, this note of caution there is the idea that the intensity of trauma can be pretty unpredictable. And so there is a fine line you're walking through in terms of letting people know, hey, I'm interested, I care, I want to know what you've been through and how it's impacted you. And at the same time, man, I don't want to open up a can of worms that maybe I don't have the personal skill set to deal with in the moment, or maybe we're not in a setting where we can get you there if it kind of really becomes unraveled. Because what can happen with trauma, what generally happens actually is when that person gets overwhelmed, if we go back to our definition of trauma, they figure out a way. It's kind of, emotionally, psychologically kind of like we come apart in a sense. We don't know how to function. We don't know sometimes even who we are based on what's going on. And so we kind of pull things back together and duct tape it so that we can keep functioning because we got to take care of kids. We got to get out of the country. We got to fill out some paperwork. We got to get through the airport. And so some of the more natural automatic processes kind of kick into gear and they start functioning. And what happens with the trauma and the memories is they kind of get compartmentalized and stuffed down somewhere, and that's actually functional and that's helpful. It really is a one of the functions that's connected to denial. When we think of denial as a bad thing, but actually denial helps us function when we need to by compartmentalizing things. And so that's a big part of a traumatic reaction. And you don't want to go unpacking all of that in a setting in a time in which it's not helpful for that person. And so that's just one thing to keep in mind. And then we want to go from both in the front end and throughout the whole process. And we're going to give you some specifics about, hey, what do I watch for, so that I can tell, like, hey, is this being a helpful process, or does it seem like this may be, being unhelpful to them or harmful in some way? Because there is that possibility. So, just wanted to note that up front. Um, One of the ways that actually you help mitigate that challenge is by giving the person you're talking to a lot of autonomy in terms of hey, you have a choice here. Like, this isn't a situation where you have to answer every question I ask, and I encourage giving individuals permission up front. Like, hey, if there's something you're not ready to talk about, that's totally okay. Just let me know. Or if we start down a pathway that you're getting really stressed about, let me know and we can change course or hit pause and stop. So what you want to do is empower them to know that, hey, I'm in control of what I share and what I don't share and what I feel ready to and what I don't. And that's a very protective mode of talking with folks when they're potentially, or there's been some trauma. The next thing we have on there is pay attention to the nonverbals. So most of us, have some education. We live in a very information-oriented society, and so we tend to listen to the words people tell us far more than how they're telling us. And in this space where you're talking about trauma and psychological impact, the nonverbals are probably going to give you much better and more accurate information about how they're really doing than what they say, because people can much more easily cover or hide with their words than they can with their facial expressions, their kind of body posture, their tone of voice. Those things will often kind of give you a better read on, hey, how are they actually doing? Because they may say, hey, I'm doing fine, no big deal, but you see signs of them shaking or their voice is quavering or they're tearing up, but in their verbal may not match that. What I would say is trust the nonverbal. It's generally your much more accurate information set. So before I get into like specific kind of questions in this beginning the process, Crystal, anything you wanted to add to those kind of intro remarks?
I would just say with the nonverbal piece too, I think that hopefully that helps you also like in your own engagement with them. A lot of times people will put a lot of pressure on themselves of, I have to say the right perfect words, I have to ask the right perfect question. But in general, we do tend to, like statistically speaking, I think nonverbal communication is anywhere from 65% to 90% of what we pay attention to. And so you don't have to have perfect words either to be able to care faithfully. And so hopefully that can help alleviate some of the pressure that for those that might be type A or perfectionistic, you don't have to do that. And so it's really with your way of being with people, oftentimes is the best help that you offer. So
For sure. So I think we were just brainstorming some ways to kind of start an interaction with someone that you're sitting down with. And again, you guys are probably even more adept at this, but when I'm thinking about kind of an initial conversation with someone that I know has had trauma or potentially has, I just want to start with kind of getting a sense of, hey, how are things going for you? And that will depend on what's going on in their lives right now. Are they in transit? Are they on their way home? Did they just get back home? Are they still in country but preparing? I'm guessing is a lot of the settings you guys are going to interact with them. And so just finding out how they're tackling the tasks that they have to do is a really good marker for, the level of traumatic reaction they're having. Because if they start describing, hey, I'm really having a hard time staying focused and helping my kids with their schoolwork, or, trying to navigate the airport was just, normally it goes fine, but I keep forgetting things. Their level of functioning is just a good area to kind of get some information about how they're doing, um, you know, from themselves, or if you're talking to a parent about a kid, or sometimes even a spouse, um, in that way. And think about both kind of behavioral function, but also emotional functioning. Do they seem to have less emotional bandwidth? Are they struggling cognitively to remember and organize things? Those kinds of functional characteristics. Another thing you can kind of dive into as you're talking with them is moving into, hey, what are some of the more specific difficulties or challenges? What are the things you're struggling with? By asking, hey, what's the most challenging part of packing up to get ready to go, or now that you're back in the States, what have you found most difficult? And as you do that, you're going to get more information about their functioning under stress in particular, as they talk about what's tough and what's difficult. Um, the third thing we put up there is just asking specifically about anything that's different or new for them in terms of kind of experiences and symptoms that they have. Um, because there's almost an endless kind of number of things that could go wrong. And so sometimes starting with just a more general, open-ended um, question about, like, hey, is there something that is new for you, or that you're struggling with that you haven't before? Something that's different or changed in your experience. And so I think that's another good um, arena to begin diving in, kind of in that beginning of the process. The last thing we have there is just kind of gauging and asking about their sense of urgency, in terms of needs and how they're feeling, and need for help sometimes too, can give you a clue for the level of challenge they're experiencing. So um, yeah, that would be kind of the last thing. Um, just notice on the kind of chat a question just about autonomy, meaning personal agency. And yeah, definitely, um, that yeah, we're talking about kind of personal agency, empowering a person. And the reason that's important is because one of the key components that maintains an anxious and stressful reaction is not feeling in control. And trauma, that's one of the primary thing it attacks, because what it does is it shows and demonstrates to a person, like, hey, you weren't able to prevent this or predict it or stop it. And so suddenly there's this massive sense of being out of control. And so any other situations that they feel out of control in, they're going to be more stressed. And so the more control you can give them, the better they're going to feel and the less anxious And so that's probably the primary reason for making sure, they have the ability to say, hey, I need to take a break, or I need to stop, or hey, I'm not ready to talk about that. That gives them that autonomy,
That's good.
that sense of
And
safety.
yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Dr. Bertrand. And one thing to note too, and I should have mentioned it to you, to both of you first. In the debriefing model, we actually have two kinds of debrief. We have a trauma debrief, which is actually designed for a person or a couple or family or group or team or whatever immediately after a traumatic event. Most of us on these calls do what we call kind of standard debriefs, which is a routine either after a few number of years or on home leave or something like that. And a lot of what we're listening for too are kind of like repressed trauma or unprocessed trauma or an event that they never had. So this is great. The stuff you're talking about is listening for those things that something happened and they never talked to anybody about. And so these examples you're going through are great to be listening for those things that and so as we go forward, as I look through the things coming up, just kind of keep that lens of listening for those things that they didn't get that trauma debrief or didn't get that trauma counseling, that they went through something and hadn't talked to anybody about it, and now it's surfacing in this quote normal debrief.
Yeah, for
Thanks.
sure. Yeah, and so kind of that next slide, I think, ties right into that. We're talking about, as you're triaging, is you want to kind of begin to invite them to talk about, hey, what are the difficult things that have happened, and get some of the facts and details, um, including like how intensely did they experience it, and if it was kind of something bad that happened, how close to it were they? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the case study, because I think it talks about some of these aspects of, a trauma that happens across town that you hear about is gonna, or a traumatic event is gonna have less of an impact than one that you witness yourself or happened right next to you, or it affected you directly in some way. And so as you're listening, to those things they're sharing, those are the kinds of things you want to listen for. But again, this is the space where you want to be extra careful to watch, hey, how are they coping as they're talking about it? Because if there's a sudden increase in emotion, or they completely shut down, that may be a sign like, hey, I'm not sure they're ready for it, but now I know that, hey, when we started going this direction, that had a huge, or caused a huge reaction that would suggest to me there's some more work that needs to be done, and that may be, with a trauma professional over a chunk of time, where they work through it and maybe do something like EMDR and work through that. But these are the kinds of things you can begin to get a feel for. One of the things, as you're talking about kind of those facts and details, what I've noticed often with cross-cultural workers is that because they're in such a different environment, that their kind of gauge for what might be traumatic and what may have had a big impact on them can sometimes get very skewed. And sometimes you can kind of listen for that, and they may share something with you that's really awful, and yet for them they're sharing it as if like, yeah, it was no big deal, that happened all the time, kind of thing. And sometimes that's where, as an assessor, we can kind of gauge like, well, actually, even if that happened a lot, it's still a traumatic kind of experience to go through, and help them even sometimes recognize that, and encourage them like, hey, that might be worth diving into more, with someone when you have the time, and exploring that a little bit more. um, so the second thing I'll say is we also, want to share, or want to pay close attention to how they share it. We've been talking about that, and Crystal later is going to get into a little bit more of this in terms of, hey, what are we listening for? What are we watching for that give us a gauge for how much, or how this has affected them, and how much it's affected them. And then finally, looking at, okay, once we have a general sense of, you know, where they're at, how they're doing, what happened to them, then we can develop kind of a general care plan and provide resources, which is kind of where we'll kind of get to toward the end of our talk today. So that's kind of a quick overview um, for that. And I think the next slide I've got I'm going to cover is just some general questions to ask. So again, just kind of some tools here, and how to ask those questions. So first, I would say really always start with open-ended questions. Even if you have a lot of information about what's happened with the person, the minute you start asking closed-ended questions that have kind of one-word answers or yes and no answers, you're actually restricting the information you're getting. And so the more open-ended you start, the more likely they're going to share the things that are most prominent for them. And then from there, you can narrow down in with more kind of restricted or closed questions. So start really open-ended, kind of throw the doors open, give them a blank slate to kind of um, chart out, what's going on with them. Um, as they're sharing things to maybe check in is, hey, were you alone? Was there anybody with you, and who was that? And what were those relationships? Because that can have a huge impact on the level of stress and potential trauma that occurs. People are much more likely to be traumatized when they feel or are alone and isolated from their safe people. And so that's a key thing to ask about. Um, the other key thing is that's key in differentiating kind of typical or normal stress from trauma is what was their perception of the event. In fact, that's actually the key component that differentiates one person experiencing trauma from another person who doesn't, because a person who experienced something as life-threatening will much more likely be traumatized than somebody who like, no, it was a little scary, but I didn't think I was going to die. And so you can actually ask them like, hey, what was going through your mind if you remember? What were you feeling, as you experienced what you just shared with me? Um, and then as they're walking through it, like if you got to a place and typically it'll be something they didn't feel safe or secure in, when were they able to kind of reestablish that sense of safety, or have they? Because if it's a more fresh thing, sometimes people still kind of in a traumatic reaction will share like, yeah, I haven't felt the same since that happened, and I can't sleep. I don't feel secure. And so asking that question about kind of their sense of safety, can you relax? Do you feel like you can get away from the memories is really a key part of what you want to kind of inquire about. Um, and then some of those questions that are kind of more specifying, as they're sharing specific things, that they'll share a host of events or facts. You could say, hey, which one of those, or what was most impactful, what hit the hardest, those kinds of things. What was most difficult or challenging for you? What was most scary? Those kinds of things. And then as they're talking about the different things, like how has it impacted different areas in your life, your relationships, functioning, we talked about before, their sense of purpose in what they're doing, because that can often be one of the things that are impacted, and also a sign of trauma is that a person's sense of purpose really gets knocked sideways, and that's one of the things that actually is a key piece of resilience in terms of bouncing back from difficult situations is, hey, even though this is difficult and this was painful and this cost me, I know why I'm here. I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm supposed to be aiming for. And trauma can often cause people to lose a sense of that purpose, or get disillusioned with it. And so that's important to ask about. Their sense of and relationship with God is really key. Trauma, it very often kind of impacts that sense of God cares. He's near. He will be my safe space. And so talk with them about, and then as we've been talking about, that day-to-day functioning is just another key thing where you can narrow in and be more specific and ask very specific questions of how are you sleeping at night? Are you eating regularly? Are you eating healthy? Are you getting any exercise? How are you getting your work done? That kind of thing to help them to get some specific information. So I think those are kind of the general questions you might ask. I think I'm going to throw it over to Crystal. She's going to talk about kind of what to keep your eyes and ears open for.
Yeah. Um, So yeah, so some of the things that we want to listen for, and we've touched on some of these already, but the structure and cohesiveness of the story, like specifically if you're debriefing a specific event, are they able to kind of have a linear arc to the story where they say like the sequence of events of this happened first, and then this happened next, and then this happened next, and they're able to do that and kind of link those things? Or is it like this happened and then, oh wait, what did that happened and then this person arrived? But like it can sometimes feel like, for me, when I'm processing through somebody who's been traumatized, I struggle to like follow them. I struggle. I'm like, wait, remind me, tell me where we are, kind of thing. And I have to kind of bring them back to and try to help link some of the things that they're telling me. Because again, they're just kind of throwing it at you in different pieces. Again, not intentionally. That's just the way that their brain is processing through it. So again, that puzzle mentality, it helps me remember that, so that I can just have empathy and not get frustrated. But then too, I think it can help them specifically if they are usually a very articulate person and they're struggling to do that. That can be highly frustrating. I had a kiddo one time, she was 13, and she had cancer treatment when she was really little, like before she had language. And she was wanting to be a part of this research study with our Cancer Institute for long-term effects of cancer treatment. But anytime she entered into our building, she started to have a panic attack. And when I sat down to sit with her to help understand what was going on for her, she kept going, Crystal, I'm a together girl. She's 13. I'm a together girl. Like, I don't know what's happening. And so just being able to normalize, hey, like, you are a together girl. Like, the fact that you want to come and help with a research study, like, that is a very together girl at 13 years old. And yet your body is telling you something that you didn't have language for. Like, you experienced things that were really stressful even before you had language for it. And so just to give an example of what that might feel like for somebody who, again, is a very together person, and yet sometimes they can't bring it together in the ways that they want to. Let's see, again, their emotions can either be very blunted or all over the place and somewhat chaotic. And then as you ask those questions, you try to get a sense of what was going through their mind when these things were happening. Does it match? Like, does it match what your sense of that experience was? Is it too muted or is it over the top? Specifically, if you're doing a debrief with a couple or with a family, if one person's story is very different than another person's story, like that can be a helpful gauge of like, ooh, one person may be more affected than another person. And so that doesn't mean that one perception is right and one perception is wrong. It's a matter of somebody's been maybe more impacted in a different way, or they're showing it in a different way. And so how do you care for both parties or the whole family where that's the case? And again, what is the intensity level minimization? If minimization is there, if avoidance is there, again, to what John said earlier with the word of caution of we don't want to completely hijack denial and minimize. Like we tend to associate that as a negative thing, but that may be their way of functioning. That may be their way of coping. Specifically, if y'all are doing debriefs really quickly after a traumatic event, they're probably very much in the state of instrumental coping. Like they're doing the things, like they're doing the tasks, and to focus on emotions and stuff like that may feel very counterproductive to trying to survive and trying to get through the logistical pieces that they need to. And so minimization isn't necessarily resistance to what you're talking about, but maybe just where they're at this current stage. We want to pay attention to it because that might be a person, if there is a lot of minimization, okay, maybe we're doing the debrief the week after, but maybe we need to circle back in 8 weeks or in 12 weeks to see if that's still online or if they've moved through it and can share a little bit more, and maybe the debrief may be more helpful there. And so that might, this is maybe a tangent, but in my work with families who've experienced grief and loss, typically after the death or loss of somebody, people don't engage in support for 12 weeks after the death or loss, again, primarily because they're doing so many tasks. They're doing the funerals, they're figuring out the money, they're trying to figure out like how they do their schedule, and just everything is so upended. And it can be very similar in trauma. And so just kind of have that awareness of instrumental coping may be the very thing that they need to be doing. And so, but we don't want to stay stuck there. So and then again, exaggerated affect. Sometimes when I'm listening to a child who kind of is saying the same thing over and over and over again with this like very verbose emotion, kind of my thought process in receiving that is just what is underneath that. Like if they're getting bigger with the way that they're emotionally telling it, they're looking for something that I haven't quite tapped into, like whether that's a validation of a feeling or because most of the time kids' behaviors and words get bigger when we haven't quite seen them. And so that's usually a thought that goes through my head is like, what am I not seeing that they need to hear, that I understand and that I care about? And so sometimes that exaggerated affect can communicate this persistent need to be seen in that. Which again references back to what John walked us through with Genesis of God. When we can't see, the Lord sees everything. And so we get to remind them of that too, of this is the hope that we have, and to be able to offer them, I'm trying to understand as best I can. I wasn't there. And so I'm limited. It's okay to acknowledge our limitations. We all are, but I want to understand. I want you to know how much I care about you. You're painting a picture for what this has been like, and it sounds hard, but we want to be able to tune into that as well. And then again, the meaning they attach to it. And I usually tend to listen for, is there a sense of hope, or is there a sense of hopelessness? Is there a sense of competency and capability, or is there a sense of helplessness? Do they feel, does it communicate that they felt like in control and they knew what to do in the situation, even if it went upside down, or they had no sense of what to do? They still don't know what they could have done. They're stuck in that pattern of what could I have done to have fixed this so that and what can I do in the future to never experience this again, kind of thing. So, John, would you add anything there before I move on?
No, I think you covered it quite well.
Okay. Again, and then what to watch for. Again, nonverbals can be so helpful. Of we can say one thing, but then our nonverbals kind of give us away in terms of just how stressed we are. And so, shaky voices, shaky hands, tearful eyes, looking away. And so, like all of those different things can communicate a lot. And then again, different presentations of the event from family member to family member. Again, they may have experienced it very differently. And so their vantage point, their proximity, their role may impact that very differently, meaning that a parent, an adult who has a sense of agency of when a terrible thing happens, I'm the mover and the shaker. I'm the one that does something. They have a very active role that can sometimes feel very empowering and help them not dip into a sense of helplessness. Whereas a child who's being taken care of may experience more helplessness, specifically if mom and dad in the midst of the chaos were doing the things, but they weren't necessarily focused on the kiddo. They may have felt very vulnerable in a different kind of way. And so anyways, those different presentations of things are important for us to see all of those. And then what does activation look like for them? And again, there's not one dimension that's right. Like I'm sure that you guys within each of your own families, y'all think differently, y'all express emotions differently, y'all process information differently. And so that's not gonna change with a family that's experienced a trauma, but you want to try to understand what activation looks like for them. So anything to add there, John?
Yeah, I was just thinking for both kind of what we listen for and what we watch for. One thing to remember is that your gauge really is that person, because the normal variation in humans in terms of nonverbal presentation and level of even intensity or activation is pretty variable. And so really what we're looking for is how is this different than who they are normally? And that can be tough if this is the first time you've met that person. But even if that's the case, you can gauge, when they were talking about, buying tickets to get home versus when they talked about the event, I could see a difference there. That's what you're looking for is this contrast between, talking about a potentially traumatic event and what that looks like and feels like and sounds like, and when they're talking about things that aren't related to that trauma. Or if you do have information directly, if you know the person or have had interactions, comparing that or getting it from, a family member, spouse, or, if you're working with a kiddo, a parent, like, hey, did they seem different recently? Because again, sometimes if you have just a very, I was thinking about it earlier when we were talking about kind of the disjointed nature of the storytelling or the events. Like some people, that's just how they communicate all the time. And so if that's the case, then it's not necessarily a sign or a symptom. But if like Crystal's example of her young lady who normally is pretty tied together, very good communicator, and then in certain circumstances, like, whoa, I'm just all over the map. That's what you're looking for is that difference, that outlier kind of data and experience.
Right.
Somebody's asking what the defining activation or what does activation mean?
Yeah, kind of they're both physical as well as verbal response to some of the questions and some of the things that you're processing through. And so, as John was just describing, like when you talk about like a day-to-day thing, their tone of voice, their eye contact, their level of visible stress may look very different than when you're talking about the event that's traumatic. And so, yeah, I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I
So
think
they
that
get kind of
that
turned on, more or
terminology,
less. Like
yeah,
they get like, oh, they changed.
Mhm.
Okay, gotcha.
yeah, the terminology comes out of kind of the stress response literature that this is one of the things that our body does when it perceives stress or danger is it activates. And there's a whole cascade of biological things that happen that then come out behaviorally,
Gotcha.
like movements are quicker, clenching jaws, eyes are wider, more glancing around. And so really it's the stress response, I think would be another way to think about what activation is.
But in essence, they're acting and behaving differently. Like you see a difference in them.
Yeah. With
Gotcha.
higher, yeah, specifically in the higher energy, higher mo movement direction.
Gotcha. So something different. Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
And I think of it in terms of like a feel, like there's a like the sense of urgency piece of what John was talking about earlier. There's an intensity to them and like a pressured way of speaking, all of that, that it's like most of the time, like when I'm experiencing it, I have to resist like wanting to pull away, like wanting to literally physically move back because there's kind of a intensity to them, if that makes sense. Um, so yeah, which leads into kind of um, the next slide of just conclusions of, again, you've entered in with this family, this couple, whoever you're meeting with. You've gathered all this information. You are trying to help them have a sense of feeling seen and known and valued and cared for in the midst of something that was really, really difficult. And then how do we think about this? Like, how do we assess? Is this a healthy and typical response? Or is this an unhealthy or atypical response? And just a note, I think John said this earlier, of like you're not expected to be a counselor or a psychologist or to be assessing this on kind of that clinical level. It's more of a kind of a gut feeling of, does this feel um, from your perception and with the people that you've interacted with, typical? And so some of the variables that go through my mind are, again, what is the intensity level? What is their sense of ability to keep moving? What is their support level, their community, which I know John is going to talk about here in a second. All of those things And again, in the debrief that happens immediately, my expectation is not necessarily that they are able to talk through a traumatic event completely fluidly. It'd be great if they can. That shows high resiliency. But are they able to do the day-to-day tasks and the things that they need to? And do they have support around them to where when they are able to feel their feelings and they're able to do that? And so again, thinking of like that 4 to 6 week window, we want to catch them within that, so that if they are having traumatic kind of symptoms, that we don't push it out too long where it can develop more persistently. And so I'm trying to think what else to share with regards to that. John, feel free to jump in.
Yeah. Yeah, nothing additional pops out for me. I think that
Okay.
conclusion.
All right. Well, then tag your it. Helpful tips.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. So we wanted to, just dive into just some helpful things to remember and do as you're kind of talking with folks in that space of debriefing. This is kind of comes out of that idea of kind of increasing of autonomy and giving them control is match your pacing with what their speed is. And if kind of pay attention to if they seem like they're feeling rushed, you want to slow down. If they're looking bored, you may want to speed up, and also again just make some room for some pauses or breaks depending on how long of a time you guys are sitting and how intense it feels. But just kind of be aware of kind of their physical and emotional functioning as you're kind of pacing and going through things. Um, as we've been talking about, one of the things you want to, not just look for at specific times, but across the whole thing is how well are they regulating emotionally? Do they seem to be, have a typical normal response level, or does it seem all over the map and kind of reactive and volatile? And again, you want to adjust how you're kind of walking through the process based on how they seem to be regulating at that emotional level. Um, Again, some of this stuff may seem pretty obvious, but just some thoughts that we had that um, you really have to kind of make room for a pretty big variety of responses because you're certainly dealing with all kinds of different situations that people have been through, and that's just massively compounded, as you guys know, when you move out of your home culture and into new cultures and new value systems, new governmental systems that can create a wide array of experiences. But then even within different individuals, there's just very different personalities. And so we have to balance that question of, hey, what's normal and abnormal based on not just would be normal for us or for a person who was raised and lives in America, but a little bit more broadly and not for just a certain personality type, but across multiple personality types. And the more information you get, the longer you sit with someone, the better sense you get of that. But we do want to make room for just some very different reactions and things that they share. Another thing that I think is really helpful to do is a lot of people, and I think Christians may be and particularly vulnerable to this, is feeling like what they're thinking and feeling or their functioning is somehow bad or wrong or shameful. And so sometimes just offering some information about, hey, this is quite common, or many people who've been through what you have been through experience exactly these kinds of things, can be really helpful to help them not feel kind of odd or different or stuck out. And so we call that normalization. So just normalizing, hey, even if you're having really unusual experiences, it's normal to have those kinds of unusual experiences after a very unusual situation or experience. So I think that normalization can help them feel more comfortable and calmer through the process. Again, probably stuff you guys know, but be just self-aware as you're talking with somebody, to be very empathic in your response, to match kind of where they're at. And if they're sharing something really hard and painful, let them know that you hear that, and with some nonverbal communication of your own, some warm, compassionate facial expressions, some tones of voice, verbalizations of, oh man, that's rough. I'm so sorry to hear that, so that they know that they have an audience that's tracking with them. Um, you don't want to go overboard with that, because then you start interjecting your own kind of value system in there, but you want to kind of match where they're at, so that they know you're connected and listening without adding to what they're sharing by, overreacting. If they're not really freaked out by something, you probably shouldn't be expressing you're freaked out by it. You should just gather the information, kind of walk along, and maybe probe a little bit, but have a matched expression or empathic response. Um, Again, kind of this goes along with that normalization idea of just, hey, your presence in the conversation and in the room, needs to be one that feels safe, and part of that is non-judgmental, in that you make room for all kinds of different reactions that people have, and say, hey, it's okay that you're struggling with that. It's okay that you feel that way. It's okay that you're questioning those things. And I find this is particularly important for cross-cultural workers in the mission space, to make room for, it's okay to have doubts. It's okay to at times lose sight of, hey, why am I doing this? Is this really worth it? Like, that's pretty normal and typical for all human beings. And a lot of times people will hide that because they feel like they're not supposed to, or they're going to be judged. And so the more non-judgmental you can be with your presence, the more information they're going to feel comfortable to share, and more open they're going to be. Um, the last thing we had kind of thought about was in context where, a lot of times you may be talking to a whole family, you do want to be very kind of conscious of kids, and if they are present or not. And, if I would say, if they are present, assume that they're listening. Even if they're a young child, a lot of times we can kind of, oh, they're all playing in the corner. We can talk about this horrible thing that happened. And kids can very, very easily get some of that vicarious trauma, even if they weren't there and a parent sharing their own trauma. Kids are very attuned to their parents' emotional state, and they can look like they're in a different world. But if they hear some sense that, oh, mom's not okay, I guarantee their radar is going to be on that. And you don't want to unnecessarily affect kiddos by sharing stuff in front of them that they don't need to hear. And sometimes parents, because they may be very much in their own experience, may not be aware of that or thinking about it at the time. And so sometimes, as kind of the responsible person in the room, you may need to kind of, hey, can we hang on for that for a minute? And maybe so and so can take the kids out and do some coloring with them or something. And then we can feel a little more free to talk through that stuff and hear, just to protect kiddos in that space, because that can be potentially challenging. So anything you would add to those tips we had talked through, Crystal?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit them pretty well. The only with the piece is if they are present, if parents really want them to be present, maybe they have concerns about their kids and how they're processing through certain things that they maybe were a witness to. Again, moderate, like, do they need to be there for the whole thing? What is their time and attention to be able to engage in that? My general rule of thumb is that kids can only handle hard emotional conversations for very short periods of time. It's kind of like they can only go into the deep end of the pool for a very short period of time, then they need to come up for air. And so they need to be able to have outlets for energy. They need to be able to color and to disengage. And so depending on the different ages of the children, do they have capacity for that? And in general, and will parents be able to share as fully as they need to in order for that to be effective with children present? And so sometimes you can address maybe more effectively the issues with the kids without the kids being present, because you're able to talk about it more fully. And then there might need to be a second meeting or something like that that's more related to the kids if parents are feeling like they need support and supporting one of the kiddos more specifically. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. So the next thing I was going to talk about is just this idea of self-care. I kind of have an issue with self-care, and I think the first thing I want to cover is, I think a lot of believers in particular have reservations about spending much time or thought about doing self-care because it sounds very much like selfishness. And I do believe that in my sphere, in the counseling and psychological world, it actually can be at times. And so I kind of like to use the terminology of self-stewardship because I think it rightly places and helps us to rightly value what we're going to talk about in terms of caring for the self. That really the key difference is what's at the center of this activity of self-care or self-stewardship. And so the classic stewardship picture we get in scripture is the parable of the talents. And I think it's a great picture of what's different between, the two servants or, stewards who were given the 5 and the 2 talents, and the last one that gave the 1. They had a very different reaction from their master. The master was very pleased with the first 2, and the last one, he basically says, "Hey, you're a wicked and lazy slave, and what you have is going to be taken away from you and given to the one that's responsible." And so what was the difference? And the difference is who was at the center of their thinking. Because the first 2, it's interesting because all 3 of them say a very similar thing. It's like, "Hey, we knew your values, master, that you reaped where you didn't sow." And so the first 2 took that information and said, "So I'm going to go do what you do, and that's invest it." So they kept the master at the center of their thinking. The last servant said, "Hey, I knew you reaped where you didn't sow. So what's implied here is that, well, that kind of freaked me out. So I'm going to go bury it so I don't make sure I don't lose it so I can give it back to you because I'm scared of you." And so that the center actually is actually the servant themselves. They're not thinking about God and his values. They're thinking about self. And so when it comes to this idea of self-care, God's at the center of it. And stewardship is, hey, God has given me myself, my physical health, my knowledge, my experience, my emotional health, and I need to steward that well. And so how do I do that? And so I just wanted to give you all that framework for what we're talking about and hopefully sell the idea, because this is one of the things that you're probably, whenever you get into that coaching mode with cross-cultural workers, you're probably talking about some of this stuff is, hey, are you taking good care of yourself? If you're out there doing work, you need to also care for yourself. And so we also need to think about it ourselves as carers of people is, man, am I stewarding myself well? So this is both for you guys personally and in kind of the coaching role. And there's a lot of information out there that I'm not going to go over today, but I just wanted to give that what I believe is a more biblical framework for the idea of self-care and as self-stewardship. And just remind you, man, think about all the domains for yourself and someone you're coaching of, hey, don't forget the physical, because we are embodied beings. We're not just brains. We're not just spirits. We're actually embodied souls. Um, and we need to take care of ourselves in a physical space. We're also emotional creatures. And so there are ways to care for ourselves emotionally. Relationally is a big one. Are we giving time and attention to the important relationships in our life? And then finally, the space we're probably a little more comfortable in is spiritually. Are we doing those spiritual disciplines that helps us stay connected with God? Are we wrestling through the difficulties that come up even in our spiritual life that trauma may affect? So that's just a quick thing. And I think to the question that came up in the chat just about kind of how do we care for that as we listen to people. I think this is one of those keys is, especially if you're doing a lot of this, you want to make sure you're stopping and thinking, hey, am I taking good care of myself? And if I need to process some of that secondary trauma, do I have someone that I can do that with? At the counseling center, one of the benefits of us working as a group is we share some of the harder stories with one another as part of our self-stewardship and self-care, because carrying it all by ourselves is too much sometimes. And so know who those safe people are and how to share that in a safe way that doesn't violate any confidentiality that you guys need to protect. So just wanted to throw that out there. Anything, Crystal, you wanted to add to that?
No, that looks good.
All righty. I think pitfalls are up for you next.
Yeah. And this, honestly, most of these we've already kind of talked about. So for time's sake, I'm not going to camp out here too long. One thing that I will say with okay, we don't want to rush. We don't want to pressure to share more. Again, giving agency and choice for them to be able to share at their own pace, and kind of monitoring our pace to try to match theirs as best we can. The overly dramatic response, again, if they're not freaked out by something, then can we hold our own composure? And the reality is that sometimes things are going to trigger us and are going to affect us more robustly. But that's where our own self care and our own debriefing with people that we trust, I think, is really important. When I think about my own ability to hold all the stories that I hear every day and that sort of thing, I sometimes think of myself as like a sponge, and I'm absorbing all the stuff from other people, and so I have to wring out. Otherwise, a sponge gets kind of creepy, right? If you never wring it out. And so, you have to engage in those self care strategies to be able to continue to do this work effectively over a longer period of time. Um, Lack of empathic response. Again, we've talked about that. But the jumping to conclusions, I'll say one thing here of it's our brain naturally jumps to what's familiar for us. And as we hear people's stories, a lot of times we can be quick to assume that we understand it right away. And when you get to that place of thinking you get it, it's a good kind of rule of thumb to ask 5 more questions or to think through it a little bit more, because sometimes we can go too quickly to taking what somebody is saying and putting it into our own kind of cultural paradigm of what we think and what our experience has been. And that can be kind of, it can do the opposite of what we want. We want them to feel understood and cared for in the unique ways that things have affected them, not just kind of plug and play how we've experienced certain things. And so jumping to conclusions, I would say, is a challenge for all of us. And we have to kind of check that with, am I thinking through this rightly? And what are some additional questions or responses that I can offer this person to make sure that I'm not jumping too quickly to what I think is right? Or sometimes when I'm not sure, when I'm sharing either an emotion that I see in them or an assumption around something, I'll sometimes say, I don't know if I'm getting this right, but I think what I'm hearing you say is da 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 da. And that just gives them permission to correct me if I've gotten it wrong. And so those kinds of little communication tools can sometimes help us not kind of put our foot in our mouth, so to speak. So, okay.
Good. Yeah, diving into recommendations. I think that's on my thing. This space is one where Crystal and I were kind of challenged just because, you guys know a lot more what's available, and I know that varies in different times and different spaces. So we're going to talk kind of from what we think of in these spaces, and that might or might not be available, and y'all probably have to be a lot more creative sometimes than us. But one of the key things we talked about was the idea of, hey, what kind of support network do they have in their community, both in terms of their team, if they're in a team, their agency, what kind of, connections relationally do they have, their family, obviously, and just friends. Sometimes back home can be a key place where sometimes people just need some encouragement of, hey, that might be something to share with your friend or your teammate, if you haven't, or share more with, or let them help carry that load with you. And so I think, turning people toward the community that God's put in their life, I think, is such a key thing, because we know that's one of the number one kind of factors in resilience for people is their sense of and active connectedness relationally in their world. Another thing to certainly, consider, I'm guessing, is if whatever kind of debriefing opportunity you have, there may be, need for more, or with a different, person or set of people. And again, that's a space y'all probably know a whole lot more about, but that's something obviously to consider. The other thing is, especially on the backside of a trauma that's very disruptive, that causes a lot of change in their lives. One of the things that actually is very health producing and helps people stabilize is figuring out ways to get back into normal everyday activities, so certainly with kids and stuff like that, having kids either get back in school or do schoolwork can be a very stabilizing thing. When something causes them to be taken out of school, if that happens for too long, kids sitting around and adults sitting around not doing anything is probably one of the worst things you can do. And so you may just kind of brainstorm with them, hey, what kind of things can you do to stay active as you're helping your family, to help your family stay active, and feel connected. That would be the other key piece of it. Is solitary activities probably not going to be very helpful, or not nearly as helpful as activities where they're with other people interacting, and often helping their mind not over focus on the trauma or the difficulty that they're struggling with. That the distraction actually becomes a very helpful thing, and other people are typically your best distractors when you need to be distracted. We just talked about kind of pointing them towards self-care, self-stewardship. When there is something that you're concerned about mental health wise, then sometimes it is helpful to maybe facilitate and find out what's possible in terms of a formal psychological evaluation or mental health assessment by either a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or if there's a mental health expert on their on the in the organization or team that they're working with. That can be important. A medical assessment would be another, particularly with people who can get in or experiencing a chronic uh, trauma reaction. Sometimes their physical health can get really poor, particularly around sleep, sometimes around diet. And so sometimes making sure, getting them to a doctor, making sure their physiology is functioning in the way it should, can be a really key piece of helping them recover and get healthy. And then, obviously working with a professional around the traumas or stressors in, a counseling setting. And that could be potentially a lay counseling scenario, pastoral counseling, or a professional counselor. And depending on kind of the severity of what you're seeing, you can kind of make that judgment call. But those were the things we had kind of considered as we were thinking about y'all's context, that, and most of which is how we would think through those as well if we were doing kind of a triage or assessment for folks. So I think that was it. Anything you would add to that, Crystal, before we?
No, I think you covered it well.
Okay. Well, I think the next thing we're going to do is kind of talk through a case study. And this was just probably a combination of a few different cases I've worked with that I thought kind of highlighted some of the things you guys might see. So I'm going to maybe read through that, and then that might lead us right into some questions. I'd love for you guys, so the things that we talked about today, if you were to apply it to this situation, maybe ask questions about this one in particular, or other ones that fit with you guys. And I may share some at the end just about other ways I'm thinking through, and Crystal, you as well. And then we'll jump into Q&A after that. So let me read this one to you, and we'll go through it together. So Susan came in with concerns about her son Jared, who was 11 years old. She and her family had just returned to the States from Africa 6 weeks ago on a planned sabbatical that would last 6 months. She reported that Jared was struggling to complete his homeschool assignments, and when he did, his work was often significantly poorer than it had been in the past. He had been more aggressive with his sisters and more argumentative with his parents at times, and at other times would just completely shut down and become non-responsive with his parents. When asked about traumatic experiences, Mom initially reported that there were none that she was aware of. However, later, as she was describing some of the unique chaos in the city they lived in, she described an event where she was driving the children in the city and witnessed a man being chased out into the street in front of their car, being caught by a group of men, and then beaten with fists, sticks, and rocks until bloody and unresponsive, then being dragged away by this group of men. She reported no intervention by the police due to the fact that the man had stolen property, and this type of retribution was not stopped by the authorities in that culture, and it happened on a regular basis. When asked if her children were with her in the car, she indicated that they were, and that Jared was in the front seat and was tall enough to see, but his sisters could not from the back seat. So we'll go to the next slide. We'll finish that up. Susan shared the story with almost no emotion, and actually her emotion seemed even flatter or more neutral than when she relayed this event compared to the other things she relayed. Even after sharing that Jared had witnessed this, she did not identify this as a significant event for him. And when asked how she felt it may have impacted him, she responded that this kind of thing happened all the time, and that it was typical in their part of in the typical part of the culture in which they live. So that story, most of it, details changed, like really was something that happened, and particularly the response. And so I wanted to share that one because that was kind of a real experience I had where I think that they had been in that country for quite a few years, and what really struck me was, hey, here is something that as a clinician I know, regardless of what you're setting, that's a disturbing thing for an adult for sure, but especially for a child. And for her, it had become such a common thing that she really didn't seem to recognize it as something stressful for her or for her son. And so one of the things that struck me that at least hypothetically, I was like, man, I wonder how much trauma may be blinding her. You know, she's trying to cope with her own trauma. It's blinding her to how things affect her child. And that is one of the things that we see in traumatized adults that can be kind of a problem with parenting is the areas of trauma that an adult has can often create blind spots for that same kind of trauma in their kids. And so I think this was one of those more clear examples where I think that was present is she was 100% convinced that this event didn't affect her girls at all because they didn't see it. And she didn't think it affected her son because she didn't remember him having an effect. And she's like, well, he's seen other stuff like that. And yet, you know, the more I asked about it, the more it did begin to dawn on her as like, oh, yeah, that was pretty intense. And oh, maybe that did have a big impact. And it turned out as we worked with him a little bit more and he began to share that that was kind of a significant event that he had recalled and definitely needed some time to process. So I thought that was just kind of a case study I would share. I don't know if you had any other thoughts about that, Crystal,
This
and ways you
question,
would kind of think through that.
could it be fairly normal that she is kind of numb to it? Like that she saw it so many times that she's kind of, I mean, as horrendous as it is to us hearing about it,
Mhm.
that's the way, I don't know if she copes with it or what. It's just, she just compartmentalizes and just
Yeah.
doesn't process it.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that was kind of my guess. My hypothesis was that she was so she was kind of had made herself immune to it by kind of hardening herself to these things,
Mhm.
which is one of the things you see in folks that have experienced multiple traumas, is they kind
Mm.
of harden themselves or develop a thick skin, but then that creates a vulnerability, especially for their kids when they may
Mm.
not be seeing what they need to see, as a coping strategy. So definitely.
So they miss their kids. Keith, you had a question earlier that might play in here, especially as the son's trying to relate what he saw.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think just, as we maybe hear stories like that, um, my question earlier being about if you're hearing something that is a little more disjointed, or maybe as they're telling the story, they're just now realizing things, what are some helpful or encouraging responses that we can have? Because we certainly don't want to have harm, especially cause harm, especially if something's fresh. But storytelling is such a huge part of debriefing. And so, how can we continue to encourage the story, even if they're just discovering some things or it's a little disjointed? How can we keep them going in a way that's helpful and not harmful?
Mhm. Yeah. Did you want to tackle that one, Crystal, or?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think one kind of normalizing why that would kind of go past her, right? Like, especially if she's in that instrumental coping of like, and if she's normalizing that, like in this culture, this happens every day, like in some ways she's communicating, I can't change that. Like, I can't change this experience. And so to be able to normalize, yeah, like for you, it sounds like you're managing the stress of that by just acknowledging that it happens every day, and yet you have different resources. And so normalizing it, and then yet like gently being able to help her see the needs of her son a little bit more. It is tricky, right? Like one of the biggest goals of a parent, right, is to protect their children. And so to acknowledge that is like, that's her goal. She wasn't trying to ignore a need that he had. She just didn't see it. She didn't see it because of her own methods of managing her own stress, and that's okay. Like, but now that we do see it, what can we do now? And so I think that's uh, that's where I would go with that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I was thinking about kind of how when clients kind of share in a disjointed way, I think there is, a way to help them just by creating some external structure. And so you can kind of help maintain the thread of the story by doing some gentle redirection. You have to be careful not to make them feel like they're not being heard, but you might need to bring them back to kind of, hey, you mentioned this, and I wasn't sure how we got to that. Can we back up and help me understand how we got from here to there, and just kind of help remind them of the central kind of plot narrative that they may not be able to track because of the trauma. You can kind of help hold that and carry that for them just by some gentle redirection and reminders, and just good questions of, hey, what happened next, and what were the outcome of those kinds of things, just to help create a structure for the narrative. Any other, yeah, I was kind of jumping into Q&A. Any other questions you guys had about the content or the case study?
I have another question, if that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
As you were talking about, first, I want to say I appreciate your thoughts about self-care and self-stewardship, and I think that's really critical to have an important definition and a framework. I would also imagine it's incredibly difficult to navigate that, especially when you're potentially dealing with someone with trauma. You have to work really hard to give them a sense of agency. And so giving them the freedom to make some of those self-care choices that they believe are self-care and we disagree, or whatever. I am having a hard time verbalizing a question, but could you share a little more about that, how you navigate what sounds to me like a pretty difficult terrain, giving them that agency to make self-care decisions, but they might be selfish, for
Hmm.
example.
Yeah, I guess when you first mentioned it, I was kind of thinking maybe it's unhealthy, because that's another thing definitely you have to be aware of. And when I talk with people about self-stewardship, one of the things is there are coping mechanisms that are very effective, but very unhealthy. So alcohol, drug use, watching TV for hours and hours at a time, they actually help in the short term, but they can often be very counterproductive and destructive even. And so that's one of the things I'll talk through with people is, hey, you want to be intentional, and you're empowering them to make good choices. And by the same token, to that point of, if it's more not so much unhealthy in a physical, psychological sense, but in kind of a moral sense, like, is it selfish? Are they withdrawing from not caring for others in their lives? Yeah, that's just something I think you can explore with them. And if you see some evidence where you're worried that might be happening, you can just ask some good questions and help them, wrestle with that question of what is the difference between being a good steward of myself and being selfish. And yeah, just kind of be a sounding board for some of their ideas about that. Because, I think at least, the workers I've worked with generally have a high sense of calling and a sense of servanthood, because that's why they're in the work they're in. And so I usually don't have to, warn them about being too selfish. If anything, it's like, hey, you actually do need to pay attention to you, to a healthy degree.
And I think too, that's one of the elements between coaching, counseling, mentoring, debriefing is, in the pure debriefing, we don't go into the coaching, counseling,
Mhm.
mentoring. And so we're listening, we're helping them explore and they really have almost more pure agency than anywhere else in those four categories.
Okay.
Because we're not advising and counseling and mentoring unless, I mean, a lot of people do, especially after a debrief, offer coaching and offer mentoring, and some that are qualified offer counseling and go into that. But someone's doing just what I'll call a pure debrief. It kind of stops there, and one might say you might look into some counseling for that, or if you have a coach or a mentor, I'd really encourage you to discuss that further with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got to trust the Lord to carry them through with that. And that's I think one of them, at least for me as a debriefer, one of the more challenging elements is letting them go with that and trusting that they will, and having no authority beyond that. I think that's one of the trickier parts of debriefing.
But I would imagine you have to have a high trust in the family of God, right? Of like
Yeah, absolutely.
You get to play your part, and then you're praying for people that encounter them next, to be.
Absolutely.
So it's teamwork.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Crystal.
And I think that is something, as professionals, we share a lot of that, in that, we do an assessment and we offer recommendations, and sometimes people don't follow those, and
Exactly.
that is where we have to trust God for, okay, what is it you've called me to do, and this is the role you've given me, and I have to entrust the other stuff that I see needs to happen to other people.
Yes.
And that can be hard sometimes, for sure.
Yeah, it really is. Well, we're coming at the top of the hour, so to honor everybody's time, we'll close now. But Dr. Bergeron and Kersley all been this is a fantastic training, really incredibly helpful. Area, we all hear about and touch on and hear, and I think a lot of us just kind of cringe because we just don't know where to go next. And you've given us incredible insights, both what to do, how to recognize it, the mental aspects. Those pictures were just incredible, as far as just seeing the physiological reactions as opposed to just oh, you're just making it up. And gosh, no, look, your brain's actually reacting to that. It's fascinating. We had several people on the call, and I had probably another dozen that sent me notes separately saying, "Oh, I can't make that, but please make sure you're recording it." So I think this will be well received, and just can't thank y'all enough for taking the time both to create this presentation and then making the time to record it for us. So thank you both tremendously.
You're welcome. We could do it.
Yep. I hope everybody has a great day, and a Merry Christmas coming up and not too long.
Yeah. Christmas to y'all.
Right. Yep. Thank you, guys.
Bye, guys.
All right. Bye-bye. Let's see here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. You're welcome.
That was fabulous, y'all.
Glad.